Back in the early 90s, my family had just moved to a new town, and I had to go through the whole ordeal of making new friends as the new kid in school. It was the first year of high school, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but most of the kids already knew each other and had their established cliques and groups, and I hadn't really found my place. And there was this one kid, though, Tad, he went by, who was a popular and very amicable guy, but he didn't really seem to have any friends that he particularly hung out with. It was like he sort of jumped from one group to the next, being pals with everyone, but not really having any people of his own. Now, after a few days, I guess he decided that I was his people, and was rapidly becoming fast friends. Now, he was super chill, very laid back, a bit of a class clown, but incredibly smart and actually funny, unlike just about every other high school kid who thinks they're a comedian. Now, that November, he handed me an envelope. Inside it was a very formal, very nicely printed invitation to spending Thanksgiving dinner at the Smith's house, not their real name. Now, Tad was kind of cagey about it, almost as if he didn't actually want me to say yes, but I think I only picked up on that in retrospect. At the time, I was unsure because I always enjoyed spending Thanksgiving with my family. We'd usually go to my uncle and aunt's house and have a big extended family gathering. Now, I talked to my parents about it, and they were insistent that I accept the invitation. There would be plenty of family Thanksgivings, and they wanted me to make friends and have a finally good time. And they sold me on it, and by the time the big day came, I was very excited. Now, when I arrived at the Smith's house, Tad answered the door, and I was surprised to see that he was dressed sort of fancy. Like, have you ever seen that review bra guy on YouTube? He was actually dressed like him, with all of his hair slicked back and a waistcoat on like he was dressed for church. And I was dressed in my usual normal 90 kids attire, and Tad looked me up and down, and I saw some kind of worry come across his face and didn't really understand it. Now, he led me into the living room where his mom and young sister were, and they introduced themselves, and they seemed great, although kind of strange and maybe malnourished, perhaps, like a bit skinny. Now, Tad's mom, Jennifer, gently told me that typically the family dressed smart for Thanksgiving, but hopefully Mr. Smith would understand the miscommunication. Now, this was starting to make me feel a bit nervous. And then there was a little sister who talked to me in such an odd, polite way. The house itself also felt kind of lifeless, like it was almost too clean. It didn't look lived in. There were no family portraits on the walls, no memorabilia, no magazines on coffee tables, nothing. It could have been a house straight out of a catalog, or what I now know would be called a show home, and it just sort of smelled sterile. It was all so strange. So Mrs. Smith led us into the dining room. I don't want to sound ungrateful, but my heart just sank. See, I was used to Thanksgiving spreads being kind of awesome, and this was just pathetic. A turkey, and 8 roast potatoes, a tiny pot of mac and cheese, some very limp-looking vegetables, just really unpleasant, and a spread that adult me would now be ashamed to present to a guest. Now, Mr. Smith, I never did learn his actual first name, was just standing at the head of the table like some goddamn king. Tad leaned over to me and whispered to make sure that I referred to his dad as Sir and always made eye contact if I spoke to him, and only to speak to him if he spoke to me first. I genuinely felt like this was some type of prank at first, but it was very clear from the atmosphere that this was not. Now, Mr. Smith did not greet me or introduce himself. He gave me a sort of nod and then continued to acknowledge that I was there. I was seated to his left, Tad opposite me, and then the little sister sat next to Tad, and Mrs. Smith sat opposite her. And this positioning is important for later because you need to know that I was in reach of Mr. Smith. And so I followed the lead of the others and stood behind my chair while Mr. Smith spouted a rambling, droning grace that seemed to last forever. And weirdly, too, at no point did he actually mention God or Jesus or anything. It was just about giving thanks and appreciating the things we have. But it wasn't directed at anyone or any particular deity. Now, I didn't really notice this at the time, but looking back, it seemed incredibly odd. Anyway, we finally sat down, and Mr. Smith cut the turkey and started piling it on his plate, and I sort of loosely reached out for a roast potato. Now, without warning, without a word, Mr. Smith backhand slapped me across the face. I was absolutely speechless. It hadn't been hard enough to really hurt or anything, it was just hard enough and belittling enough to leave my face red, both from the slap and the embarrassment of being pimp-slapped by my friend's parent. Like, holy crap, I had never in my entire life been struck by a friend's parent before, and certainly not when I was old enough to be in high school. Mrs. Smith quickly stepped in and told me in a very trembling voice that it's custom to allow the man of the house to dish out his entire portion before anyone else was allowed to take any food. Mr. Smith then added very sternly that usually the man of the house would eat his entire portion before the rest of the family could eat either, but they were making an exception because they had guests who did not seem to understand respect. I wasn't a particularly angry or petulant child, but I was burning with fury inside. Tad kept giving me these looks like I was supposed to understand what was going on here, but I just didn't. I was too scared to take any food at this point, and I had to be prompted by Mrs. Smith to help myself eventually. And when I did, I was horrified. The food had looked unappetizing, but it was worse than it seemed. Everything was lukewarm at best. The vegetables were undercooked. The pasta and the mac and cheese were crunchy from being underboiled. And worst of all, the turkey was pink and slimy, perhaps the most undercooked meat I'd ever encountered in my life. And the rest of the family were picking at their food as if they were aware of how vile it was, but Mr. Smith was devouring his portion with almost a sort of gusto, for lack of better words. And not once did he praise the chef, though, which I'm certain was Mrs. Smith because I can't imagine Mr. Smith being the type of man who did the cooking. Now, about halfway through the meal, the undercooked and horrifically prepared food began to take its own toll on my sensitive stomach, and I felt serious, unpleasant pains coursing through me. I tried masking it, pushing my food around on my plate with my fork, but Mr. Smith noticed and told me to eat up, son. It's impolite to be ungrateful to one's host. And I finally spoke up and said that I had a really bad stomach ache, and could I please call my parents to come get me because I didn't want to ruin their Thanksgiving dinner. Now Tad, Mrs. Smith, and the little sister all went totally pale and silent at this. Mr. Smith's face went a sort of shade of crimson, and I swear, if this had been a cartoon, steam would be bursting out of his ears. Unfortunately, this was real life. It was my life. "How dare you," he screamed, and then proceeded to lecture me on how I was the rude, uncouth little deviant. And then he turned his sights on Tad. It was Tad's fault for inviting someone like me from the wrong side of the tracks to their family meal. And Tad began apologizing profusely, saying that I didn't know any better, and of course I would stay and finish my meal. And I felt so betrayed. But then I kind of realized why Tad had no choice. Mr. Smith stood up, dragged Tad to his feet, and proceeded to force him over his knee, pull his pants down, thankfully not his underwear, and spanked him with such violence that I'm amazed Tad didn't burst into tears. Mr. Smith then looked at me, and it was a very clear threat. Either I play ball or Tad would suffer the brunt of my actions. So I forced the rest of my food down, struggling against stomach pains, struggling not to throw up, and struggling not to burst into tears when I thought about my own family and the absolute hell it must be living with this one. And eventually dinner was finished, and in silence we ate some type of sort of slimy jello with some fruit in it, and as soon as dessert was finished, Mr. Smith promptly commanded that I leave and to think on my actions that night and the shame that I brought on myself and my family. It was an hour's way back to my house, and I opted to just take it rather than dare ask if I could call my parents. Now, when I got home, our own Thanksgiving meal was still underway, and Mom and Dad just cheerfully asked me if I wanted to join in. Now, I kind of snapped at them, burst into tears, and then ran upstairs and threw up. And I spent the next 3 days bedridden with this food poisoning, during which time I explained to my parents as best I could exactly what had happened that night. And when I got to the part about Mr. Smith slapping me, I could see Dad starting to shake with rage. But then my parents surprised me by saying that different families just have different customs and values, and that I shouldn't hold it against Tad, and I should continue to be his friend. I just shouldn't visit his house anymore. Now, I'd expect something else, I guess, some kind of confrontation where my dad, my hero, had gone around to the Smiths and given Mr. Smith a beatdown. Instead, it felt a bit like an anticlimax. Then, 6 months later, Mr. Smith abandoned his family, just upped and disappeared. And rumors spread around town that he'd run away with some lady of the night from the local strip club. All sorts of gossip spread about him, and things that would have made it very hard for Smith to show his face around town again. Talk of inappropriate behavior with the young boys he coached at Little League. Local cop friends of my dad claiming that Mr. Smith was a known curb crawler in the red light district. All sorts of things. And as soon as Smith abandoned his family, Tad really came into his own. We'd stayed friends, just like my parents had asked of me, and Tad went on to go from class clown to actually valedictorian, and he spent every Thanksgiving with my family after that. And when it came to his turn to give thanks, he'd always say that he was thankful for whatever caused his dad to show his true self. And whenever Tad would say that, my own dad would give me a look and a bit of a wink, and I never asked him about it. I never wanted to know. I knew enough to know that Smith was still alive, at least, and throughout the years, he made a few attempts to contact Tad, usually begging for money, and Tad and I are still great friends. He always ignores his dad pleading, and he especially ignores it when his dad mentions the ultimatum that he was given back then, which forced him to leave his family. And Tad doesn't want to know what that means, and neither do I. But all I know is that sometimes people do get what's coming to them, and for that, I'm thankful as all heck. So this happened in the late 2000s. My little cousins were unholy terrors, to say the least. 2 boys, 8 and 9, the sons of my paternal uncle. They were born 2 months apart, have 2 different moms, neither of whom are my uncle's wife, and they spend other weekends with their dad, and I guess you can't blame them for being a little messed up and out of control when their family background is just so convoluted. Now, this explanation makes my uncle sound like some kind of womanizer who went around inseminating a variety of different women, and, well, I guess that's true, but not for nefarious reasons. First girlfriend actually died in a car accident a month after giving birth to Monkey, the oldest son, and my uncle had a sort of friends with benefits consolation hookup with one of his best friends, and the contraceptive broke, and she got pregnant, and they decided to keep the baby, who's named Morley. And so thankfully, he has a great relationship with Morley's mom, and things are as good as they could be, I guess. He's also now happily married with a 2-year-old daughter whom Mikey and Morley idolize. But the boys, who we call the twins even though they're not, and they have different moms, were absolute prank kings. They loved nothing more than causing chaos, pulling off jump scares, the kind of goofs that you get from joke stores, you know the types of things. Exploding cigarettes, lighters that squirt water, dollar store crap. It was always in good fun, but it was constant. You knew that any family gathering was going to be about the twins, and they made darn sure that we were darn sure of it. Now, it makes me so sad looking back. I miss the days when these dumb little kids were the pride and joy of the family. I miss the days when the family was a thing. Now, fair warning, this is not a happy story. It doesn't have a happy ending, and when you give thanks this Thanksgiving, make sure that you show gratitude for your loved ones who are still with you. Don't take anything for granted. Things can change on a dime, and life has no rewind buttons. No kid deserves to have the weight of what happened with the twins on their shoulders. Now, that Halloween, the twins had gone as pumpkin ghouls, basically skeleton onesies with creepy pumpkin masks. It was kind of cool, and the twins were very pleased with themselves. I'd taken them trick-or-treating, which made them feel badass to be chaperoned by their cool cousin, even if they could not grasp why a girl had dressed as Jason Voorhees, because Jason's a boy. Kids are odd creatures. And so the twins weren't content on using their pumpkin masks just once. In their minds, pumpkins are Thanksgiving-related too, which is true, I guess, with pumpkin pie and all that jazz. So they smuggled their pumpkin masks into our family Thanksgiving gathering in their backpacks, just waiting to find the perfect moment to use them. The woman of our family did the cooking at our Thanksgiving get-together. Maybe this is a bit rude, but the truth is, Grandma, my mom, and my uncle's wife were the best chefs by far. Unfortunately, I did not inherit Mom's penchant for delicious culinary skills, and you could say I have a particular set of skills, and my skills lie elsewhere, extremely far from a kitchen. I'm a programmer. And so the twins decided a great prank would be to hide in the broom closet in the kitchen and burst out on whichever poor, unsuspecting chef happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. And this just happened to be my grandma, preparing the gravy boats. Grandma had just finished mixing up this thick gravy. We always have a selection of different thicknesses to suit everyone's taste, when the twins came bursting out of the closet in their pumpkin mass, yelling whatever spooky nonsense they decided to scream. Grandma was not a young woman. She was in her early 70s when this happened, and despite being used to the twins' antics and jump scares, I guess this time it caught her. She dropped the huge gravy boat onto the floor, which shattered, sending gravy and glass spilling all over the tiles near the kitchen door. And then the way the twins told it, she began to clutch at her heart. She was breathing really heavy and leaned forward to steady herself and then just collapsed into a chair at the breakfast bar. Now the twins panicked, pulled their masks off, and ran to Grandma to check if she was okay. She was still clutching her chest, breathing hard, and the kids were maybe crowding her and apologizing or whatever. And Grandma told them to give her space, and she was fine, she just needed a minute. But the way the twins tell it, they were absolutely sure that they'd given Grandma a heart attack and killed her. Now, thankfully, that was not the case. Now, what did happen, though, was that Granddad came running in from wherever, panicked by the sound of the gravy smashing onto the floor, and he threw the door open, ran straight into the kitchen, and immediately slipped on the thick, spilled gravy all over the floor. Now, I was behind them when this happened. I saw it all go down. I saw Granddad skid, his arms pinwheeling in a way that was almost comical if not for what happened next. He fell forward, his nose hitting the corner of the table, and they say it killed him instantly, the bone of his nose being thrust backwards into his brain. But I don't believe them. I saw him writhing on that floor. I saw him clawing at his face, and the way his neck was flopping at an almost impossible angle. I saw him take at least a minute to die. And so did Grandma, and so did the twins. We all watched as our beloved Granddad died in a pool of gravy and glass in front of his wife and grandsons, all of whom would later blame themselves for his death. Grandma blamed herself for overreacting and dropping that gravy, and the twins blamed themselves for pretty much everything. And you can understand why they did, even at that age. Grandma didn't even make it to Granddad's funeral, as she passed away a few days later of what I like to say is a broken heart. Her heart just gave out, and of course the twins blamed themselves for that too. They insisted that they weakened her heart by what they did, and no matter what we said to them, no matter how much we tried to convince them that they were just kids having fun, doing kid things, they wouldn't listen. Mikey made it to about 18, Morley's still around, but he's in and out of rehab, and the whole family does everything we can try to convince him to forgive himself, but he just won't. None of us blame Mikey and Morley. I just wish Morley wouldn't blame himself. So, this Thanksgiving, be grateful for the ones you love and what you share with them, because you never know when the most ridiculous, unexpected, and unseen event might just change your whole family's lives forever. So to start off, my family's generally conservative. We're not like super big on politics or make it our identity or whatever, but if you had to ask, yeah, we kind of sway that way. And the only member of our family who takes it a lot further is my uncle, who's my mom's sister's husband. He was a card-carrying, red hat-wearing MAGA guy with the bumper stickers and everything. He's pulled away from this a bit now after all this stuff with the list, but we're not going to get into that. Now the point is, my uncle is a card-carrying devout Republican and most importantly, a member of the NRA and an absolutely huge gun nut, and I say that respectfully. Now, family Thanksgiving is normally fairly chill. My uncle might be one of the most zealous of us all, but he's also a very super respectful dude, and we're not the type of family who get into political arguments. Even with my sister, who is a lot more left-leaning, we have our differences, but we're a loving family, and I generally think that we, including my uncle, are all good people. And I could tell that there was going to be trouble at Thanksgiving in 2023 when my sister showed up with her new boyfriend. Now, for starters, you could see that he had a sort of effect on her. She'd done that whole blue and pink hair thing, which even she had always gently mocked. But I know my sister well, and she kept shooting me these looks of like, I'm sorry about this, and had a kind of nervous disposition. Anyone else might have assumed that she was just referring to her weird new look, but we're twins, and I knew that she meant something else, and that something else was her boyfriend. Now I'm just going to call him Jack, short for jackass, and right from the beginning, Jack was on the offensive. You could just tell. He was very snippy and coldly polite with my parents, which put me on the defensive immediately, and the same with other family members. After the food was dished out and he announced that he was vegan, something that we had not been informed of at any point, despite Mom sending the usual email out to any family members who might be bringing guests asking if there were any dietary requirements. And so Jack made this big fuss about being vegan, and my mom, bless her, went into the kitchen and went through all the damn boxes of ingredients to work out which food would be safe for him to eat as a vegan, as if it was some peanut allergy or something, while the rest of us all waited to get tucked in. Now, Mom came back with this beautiful handwritten list of foods that were definitely vegan-friendly and handed it to Jack. I saw the list, and there was certainly enough food on there to have a decent meal. Jack looked it up and down, sort of sneered, and remarked that he'd starve if he only ate the vegan dishes, and so he guessed that he'd have to make an exception this time around. Now, you're probably thinking that he just dished up a vegetarian platter, not vegan. No. This guy piled up turkey, ham, pigs in blankets, everything else the rest of us ate onto his plate, and I watched him eat. He went into that meat in a way that made me certain that this man had never been a vegan in his entire goddamn life. What was the effing point? And I kept glancing at my sister, and she just kept flushing with embarrassment. And so we're about 2/3 through the main course, and it's been going surprisingly well, mostly thanks to Jack stuffing his face with turkey so he didn't have room to speak. And we'd just been talking about regular things. I think everyone at the table, especially Uncle Ron, knew to avoid any kind of political discussions. And then finally, Jack took a break from stuffing his face with meat and dairy and made the quip. And it went something like this. He pointed out the front window towards my uncle's truck, which, if you remember, was very magnified back then, and then said, "Nice truck I saw in the driveway. Didn't know Mitt Romney was here." Mitt Romney. Out of literally any Republican you could have picked for the joke, he chose Mitt freaking Romney. And we all just sort of looked at each other like, is this guy trolling? But my sister shot me this look saying, no, please just let it go. And that's when I started to worry. Was this guy maybe a bit unhinged? Now my uncle, God bless him, paused for a second, and I saw his neck turn red with anger for the briefest of moments. And then he just laughed and said something like, Mitt Romney. Come on, son. You could have at least gone for someone cool like Hulk Hogan. So then Jack says, well, I don't think being a MAGA is very cool in any way, and then started talking about women's rights and Roe versus Wade, something which I would note most of my family did not support being repealed, and my sister put her hand on Jack's arm and just asked him to drop it, and he shrugs it off, a bit too violently for my taste, and my sister, who's normally very bubbly and chattily, just sort of falls silent. Now, I've got it in my head that this absolute chuckle frick is maybe an abusive partner, and so I give my uncle the look. He knows the one. It's the look I give him when I'm saying, hey, Uncle Ron, me and you are gonna screw with this guy, okay? And so Ron starts asking me how the shooting's been going, whether I've been hitting my goals at the range, and when we're gonna go out hunting again together. You know, completely innocuous things that would only rile someone up who's gonna have a problem with guns. And of course, Jack immediately leaps on this. He starts ranting about gun culture and this and that, and then he says, of course, It's sick just how anyone can own a gun these days despite obvious mental instability, and clearly looks at Uncle Ron when he says this. Now, Uncle Ron knows that we're trolling this guy, so instead of getting mad, he just ignores Jack and starts telling me all about the new firearms he's purchased recently. It was hilarious. And at one point, he was just completely making up guns that don't even exist, and also claimed to own a military-grade railgun that required a train track to move. At no point did Jack call him out on any of this or call BS, just as we suspected. Instead, he starts going on about how concealed carry should be abolished in our state, and if someone like Uncle Ron should be allowed to own, and it was some gun from Star Wars that Uncle Ron had claimed to own, I forget the name, and that he should at least be forced to let everyone know that he was carrying. Uncle Ron just very calmly smiled and said something like, "Nah, son. If I'm going to protect myself with a firearm, then I hardly want the bad guy to see me coming." Now, Jack just got furious about this, and I'm not going to type out the whole damn argument, but it led to Uncle Ron losing his cool, and they got into a full-blown screaming match about politics and Trump and Kamala, and the rest of us just sort of sat there looking at each other like this is the worst Thanksgiving ever. And so then Jack gets so angry that he leaps up from the table, knocking his chair backwards. My sister again reaches out to touch his arm and calm him down, and this time he actually shoves her away. So now, of course, Uncle Ron jumps up too, and he starts screaming at Jack like he's a pathetic, weak little man and blah, blah, blah. And that's when Jack reaches into his cardigan, pulls out the pistol that he's been concealed carrying for this entire Thanksgiving meal. Everyone just sort of freezes, falling silent. Uncle Ron stares back at Jack, and a look of peace and calm falls over his face. Because despite being the biggest gun nut I know, Uncle Ron is clearly not carrying at a family Thanksgiving dinner. And so here he is, face down with a supposed anti-gun vegan meat-eater who's now pointing a gun at him. And Ron just says, "You don't want to do this, son. You don't want to throw your life away over some old man's political opinions. This isn't you, etc., etc." And he really started trying to convince Jack that he was a good person, that he was better than this, time to prove it, etc. And Jack had the absolute gall to say that Ron was right. He was better than all of us, and he'd prove it by lowering his gun. And that's when something unexpected happened. From behind Jack, a huge vase came flying towards his head and exploded as it smashed against his skull. Jack then fell, tripping over the fallen chair, and the gun flew out of his hand and landed on the ground, and I quickly went for it. Now looking up, I saw my sister standing there, breathing hard, and this absolute look of fury on her face. Now as I looked at the gun in my hand, I realized what she'd clearly noticed, which she went on to explain. Jack, the idiot that he was, hadn't taken the safety off his pistol. He clearly had no idea how to use it, so rather than trust him to actually lower the gun, and just in case he suddenly realized the safety was on and reacted differently, my sister decided to just brain him with the vase that we'd inherited from our great Nana, and I think the old woman would have approved. Now anyway, my sister quite understandably broke up with Jack and, yes, eventually lost the blue hair. And as a responsible gun owner, Uncle Ron reported Jack's misuse of a firearm to the cops, and now he's banned from owning a gun, I do believe. Now my sister also managed to successfully take a restraining order out against him and reported him for some other stuff because, as it turns out, like I suspected, he had been an abusive partner. So we look back at that story and tell it with a comedy angle, usually Uncle Ron doing the telling, but I'll tell you what, finding out afterwards the type of things he put my sister through, psychological torture in particular, it made me wish that we were the kind of gun-toting, rootin'-tootin' Republican trigger-happy family that Jack clearly accused us of being. I'm not a violent person, but I do feel like at the very least he deserved to feel the fear of having 7 or 8 guns pointed at him to calm him down. So I'm a woman in my 40s, and I run a Meals on Wheels service. I run the business all year round, but on Thanksgiving, I go that little extra mile to just bring a bit of extra joy to my elderly and disabled clients. Now, there was this one old fellow that I used to visit, and he only had me booked in for Thanksgiving. He did fine most of the year, but he liked having a nice Thanksgiving meal prepared for him, and I think he liked the company too. He told me a number of times that he didn't have any family and it was just him. So Thanksgiving 2018, I turned up at his house with a special ham roast prepared for him with love. I looked forward to seeing this old fella. I was kind of excited for him to answer the door and see his usual beaming smile, his shiny white false teeth perched precariously in his mouth. No, I'm just trying to sound silly here, but I was a little surprised when a much younger guy answered the door. Now, I told him who I was, Meals on Wheels, and explained that I was here to see that old fella and cook for him. And the young guy looked confused for a second and then said, "Oh, damn. His grandfather was in the bathroom and must have gotten the timing wrong." And the guy invited me in and encouraged me to start preparing the food ready for the old guy to finish his bath, and that it'd be a nice treat when he got done bathing and realized that he had a Thanksgiving meal to look forward to. Now, the young relative ran upstairs very quickly, and I heard him calling through the bathroom door, telling his grandfather that the Meals on Wheels lady was there for him. And I couldn't hear the grandfather's response, of course, but why would I? Now, I went about warming up the food that I'd brought. Typically, we cook it in advance, and then it just needs heating up in the client's oven. And the process takes maybe 10 minutes, so I went to wander around the living room, which I'd been in many times. The grandson, who I'd imagine was probably in his mid-20s, was still upstairs, maybe getting his granddad out of the bathroom. Now, I started looking at some of the photos on the wall. They all just showed my elderly client at different stages in his life. However, I started to notice something odd. The young man who'd let me in didn't seem to appear in any of these photos. In fact, there was nothing that I could see that suggested that my client even had grandkids. And then I remembered. He told me previously that he didn't have any living family, so who the hell was this young guy who let me in? The old man was upstairs in the bathtub, so there was nothing suspicious, right? And then I realized I had absolutely no evidence that my client really was upstairs in the bathroom. All I'd heard was the young guy talking as if he was speaking to someone. It could have been completely fabricated for all I knew. I decided to play it safe and called upstairs that the food was almost ready and was my client nearly ready to come down. And the young guy shouted down, sounding almost annoyed in that, yeah, they were coming. He was just helping Grandpa dress himself and various things. This was definitely suspicious. The old fella might have been a Meals on Wheels client, but he was healthy and fit enough not to need home help, and he certainly did not need help getting dressed after a bath. Still, though, it was possible that maybe he'd fallen and there was a reasonable explanation for this. Now, I turned the oven off and left the food in there and called upstairs that I was going to be going because I had other clients to see, so I'd left the food warming in the oven. I didn't receive a reply, so I decided that I'd just leave and then call in a wellness check once I was safely out of the house. However, as I tried to leave, I discovered that the front door was locked. Now, it was one of those types of doors with a deadbolt where you actually need a key to unlock it from the inside, and it had been locked with that deadbolt. Obviously, something was wrong here. I could hardly call the cops and say that I might have had been locked in an old guy's house by a suspicious character, so I just decided to try the back door. And that way, of course, was also deadbolted. I'd left my cell phone in the van, because typically we weren't supposed to bring devices in the clients' homes, and so I headed into the living room to either use the landline or see if there was a window that I could open to escape from or something. Now, this fake grandson was standing there, wearing nothing but his tidy whities and a poop-eating grin on his face. He started on some rant about how a dried-up old hag like me would surely be flattered to sleep with him, and that he'd even pay me if I did certain things. Now, I was speechless, disgusted. I'm happily married, and even if I wasn't, my God. I told him as much and told him that if he didn't unlock the door right this minute, I'd call the cops. Now, he just sort of laughed at that as if that was somehow a complete impossibility. And still no idea to this day why he was so confident about that. So the fake grandson approaches me and says that if I won't take him up on his generous offer, then considering I'm technically a home invader, I'm unsure of what logic he was using to decide that he had no choice but to defend himself. I asked him what in God's name he was talking about, and he just looked me in the eye, point blank, and just said, "I'm going to touch you, and then depending on how I feel, I might just bury your body in the basement." Now, I could tell he was serious. I could also tell that he was seriously on something. Later, via the police report, I found out that he was on an absolutely ridiculous amount of cocaine, but at the moment all I knew was that there was no way that this pasty creep was going to get his hands on me. And from visiting my client every Thanksgiving, I knew the living room well, and I knew that behind me there was a fireplace, and besides that, a set of tools for cleaning that said fireplace. A poker, a brush, and one of those long metal dustpans. And that's what I managed to grab when I reached behind me blindly, and that's when I swung forward, cracking my would-be assailant straight in the crotch. He howls, screams, and fell to the floor, and just for good measure, I brought that pan down again on him, the flat underside slamming into his clearly aroused groin. And I later found out that it's possible to break someone's you-know-what, and that's exactly what I think I did. Unfortunately, this is also why my attempted freak managed to get away with a suspended sentence, because I was forced to lower the charges to avoid him countersuing for some fairly serious bodily damage. But it felt pretty worth it regardless, and I'm pretty sure I dissuaded him from trying to touch anyone else in the future. Now, I found out that my client had unfortunately passed away the week before, and due to his lack of family, his Meals on Wheels order had yet to be canceled. The guy who attempted to trap me there was the new tenant, and apparently decided to celebrate his Thanksgiving by doing a truckload of drugs and trying to kidnap a Meals on Wheels worker. I don't know what became of him after the disappointingly short legal proceedings in which I had to back down from pushing too hard after I basically broke his wiener, but again, I think I did the world a favor. So I'm thankful for my near miss that day, and also thankful for my perfect aim with that dustpan. So, funny story. My name is also Joel, weirdly enough, and this story didn't take place on Thanksgiving. It was the day before, but the outcome of the story is probably the thing that I'm most thankful for. I have a pretty overprotective mom, and I mean this in a very loving way. She's the best mom ever. Now, she didn't have the easiest time raising me and worked her butt off to be the best mom she could. Now, things are better now, and she has a wonderful husband, my stepdad, and we're a tight family. But she worries about me, and in particular, a couple of years ago, she read an article about how the night before Thanksgiving has the highest rate of DUIs out of any night in the year. Now, I'm not sure if that's just Michigan, the state that I'm from, or everywhere, but apparently it's a fact. And so the year this happened, a couple of years ago, I was due to work the night shift at Kroger that Wednesday night. Now, Mom got really worried about this DUI thing, and she found out that it was so prevalent that it had been nicknamed Drinksgiving. Now, she wasn't worried about me drinking and driving, of course, but she was worried about me driving to and from work late at night and some drunk idiot crashing into me on the roads. She got so worked up about it, in fact, that eventually I promised her that I just walked to work and back that evening, even though it was a 40-minute trek either way. This seemed to placate her massively, and I thought, the walk could actually be good for me anyway. The first half of my shift that night covered up until closing time, and then the second half involved restocking and cleaning and all the fun stuff that goes on at Kroger behind the scenes. Nothing really of note happened on the shift, except I did notice some guy come in absolutely trashed, staggering around and slurring his words, and I made sure that I was close to the checkout when he came to pay, because my younger female colleague was out on checkout, but he was fine, just very wrecked. And then I watched with this mounting horror I felt as he left and walked across the parking lot and got into the driver's side of his vehicle and swerved his way out of the lot. Now, for other things, I would feel like a bit of a narc or a bit of a pest, but I did get the guy's registration and call it in, so hopefully the cops pulled him over. Drunk drivers can get effed, in my opinion. And so my shift was done, and I started the long, cold walk home. I was about halfway back, listening to some tunes on my iPhone, and I admit, it was Taylor Swift. I am actually secretly a big fan, just sort of gazing at the sidewalk to avoid any puddles or ice or anything like that. And that's when I hear the sound of squealing tires and erratic driving, and I immediately look up. There was a car swerving back and forth across the road, and I had almost no time to react. The vehicle erratically spun towards me and with a burst of speed, mounted the sidewalk and crashed straight into me. Now, it felt like I had moved in slow motion, like some kind of action movie. I saw this muscle car barreling towards me and I dove backwards into the doorway of some store. The car slammed into the bricks and I heard the sound of crumpling metal and cracking concrete, but I felt very little pain and I was sure as sure could be that I was either about to die or maybe my spinal cord had been severed and I was paralyzed from the waist down. It took me a moment to realize that the car had stopped literally an inch from me, thanks to the depth of the doorway and the strength of the brick. I was shaking and crying and collapsed forward onto the hood of the car. I barely registered when the guy leaps out of the vehicle and was yelling and crying to himself, asking if I was okay, if I was hurt, if I could feel my legs, etc. Now, eventually I managed to calm down and began talking to the very calm, very clearly sober driver of the vehicle. It turned out that he hit a patch of black ice, lost control of his car, and in trying to correct it, had ended up spinning towards me instead. The cops came, of course, and he happily took a breathalyzer test which showed a 0.0 alcohol level in his bloodstream, which was nice to know. And it totally wasn't this guy's fault at all, I guess. He was just so apologetic. And he kept insisting that I go to the hospital to get checked out, but I knew I was fine, except for a few cuts and grazes from the cracking bricks. So instead, he paid for an Uber to get me home and gave me his card to stay in touch. My mom sent him an email about a week or so later, thanking him for being so kind and telling him that she hoped that he didn't hold any guilt, and I sent him something similar. Now, that Christmas in the mail, I received a check for $1,000, and on the card he wrote something like, "Your life is worth so much more than this, but it's the least I can do." And so, almost being crushed to death by a muscular car like that didn't end up to be so bad after all. But let me tell you, those moments when the vehicle came blasting towards me, when I thought it was a drunk driver or worse, someone trying to hit me, that was the goddamn scariest moment of my life. And every year on Thanksgiving, I make sure to give thanks for surviving that terrifying ordeal. So I'm a woman in her early 20s, and last year was my first Thanksgiving alone, as I'd moved cross-country and couldn't make it back home for our usual meal. Now, I was pretty sad and depressed about all of this, even though Dad and my stepmom made a big effort to have a Zoom call with me and have a little party that day before Thanksgiving. Now, I decided that I was going to turn my frown upside down and be a good Christian and spend my Thanksgiving volunteering at a local soup kitchen. They'd been really struggling for volunteers for that day, apparently, so when I went in the week before and asked if they needed me, the large, older lady who runs it, her name was Belinda, gave me the biggest, warmest hug I'd ever had from someone I wasn't related to. And that made me feel a lot better and almost like I'd made the right decision. Now, on Thanksgiving Thursday, I arrived at the soup kitchen early and found myself waiting outside for Belinda to arrive. There were already a few folks hanging around, even though it would be another hour or so before we actually started serving food. Belinda arrived and was greeted by some of the folks who were waiting for the food, and clearly some of them were regulars, and Belinda greeted them warmly and they responded in kind. Now, she introduced me as a new helper who was with us for Thanksgiving, and I quickly added, and hopefully more than that if Belinda will have me, because I'd already decided that I wanted to volunteer at this place regularly. Just seeing the way that these people's faces lit up at Belinda's arrival, knowing that they'd get a hot meal inside them. And so Belinda opened up. I didn't realize this, but they opened up an hour before the food went out to allow people a bit of time in from the cold. It was a particularly cold Thanksgiving that year, and I thought that this was a very kind gesture. I don't know what it's like at other soup kitchens, but there was a lot more than soup on the menu that day. We couldn't afford to put a whole Thanksgiving spread, of course, but a number of local businesses had contributed dishes which just needed heating up, including 3 incredibly prepared turkeys and 2 glazed hams from a local butcher. And the rest of the volunteers showed up, and we immediately went about cooking the food, as well as the traditional vats of soup, which would be the first thing on the menu, since it would be ready before the meat and casseroles. Belinda told me that the line to get in was around the block, and we were set to have the busiest Thanksgiving on record. And I could already see every seat was filled in the seating area itself, and spirits seemed high. I felt great, and I felt genuinely proud of my decision. So the soup was ready, and I was put on serving duties, filling up cups of the pumpkin and chestnut soup specifically. And I handed every cup over with a smile and a happy Thanksgiving, and then in my head, may Christ be with you as a little bit of a personal prayer that Jesus would watch over these people who clearly needed it. "Gimme soup, bitch." And the demand caused me to look up, almost expecting to see someone I knew or some kind of joke. And the guy who stood there looked about 80 and had a hard-lived 80 at that. He was blind in one eye, and his face was pockmarked with scars, and his hair was long and lanky but bald on the top, and he was stick-thin and wiry, wearing a military-style coat. And I'll never forget his face, or his wholly fingerless gloves, or the look that he gave me with his one good eye. It was a look of utter, disgusting contempt as he eyed me up and down. Now, I tried to act as if though I'd misheard him in case I really had, so I told him that the soup was coming up, and that's when he starts to rant, saying I'm clearly some sanctimonious rich bitch with my fake-ass boobs. Not that it matters, but, they're not. And how I'm pretty and I know it, and I'm just there to make myself feel better. And then he sees the crucifix around my neck, which was hidden under my sweater, but I guess he somehow saw the imprint of the cross, and starts ranting about how I'm one of those do-gooder Christians who only helps people like him because we want a free pass into heaven. Now, I wasn't about to say anything in my defense to this guy, and I'm not going to explain myself too much here either. All I will say is that in my 25 years on Earth, there have been points where I have gone through certain things that would genuinely horrify you to hear. Parts of my childhood was so bad that I couldn't type about it even if I wanted to. And yes, I did feel good about myself for volunteering at the soup kitchen. Yes, I am a Christian. But is there anything wrong with either of those things? This freaking guy didn't know me, and he didn't have any right to judge me. And I'm sure he'd suffered too, probably terribly from the looks of him, but to assume that I was some privileged B-word who had it easy just because in his opinion I was attractive. How dare he? How absolutely dare he? And so I did what I've always learned to do in these situations. I responded as cheerfully and politely as possible, pretending that I hadn't heard a word he said because in a minute he'd be gone and I'd never have to see him again. I'd take my break, and by the time I was done, he'd probably have left. So I poured him his cup of soup and handed it over to him with a big smile, telling him that I hope he enjoyed it and had an absolutely wonderful Thanksgiving. Now, normally this makes people sort of run away feeling stupid, but not him. Oh no. This enraged this guy more than I could possibly have imagined. He took the cup of soup from me, and the scalding hot soup, and said, "I don't even want it," and called me the C word, and threw the cup of soup in my face. Everyone around him reacted in horror, but I was just frozen, like I'd passed out on my feet. I vaguely remember him running and leaving the building and my face feeling weirdly cold. And the next thing I remember is actually waking up in the hospital. I have a skin condition that, among other things, makes my skin extremely sensitive to high temperatures. The soup had been hot enough to burn away part of my cheek and sent me into shock, which had caused me to pass out and stay unconscious for a few hours. The scalding soup permanently scarred my cheek, and it wasn't bad enough to warrant a skin graft, but there is a red mark there forever that gradually kind of looks like a birthmark. And I also required an operation on my eye, which thankfully was successful, and I retained my sight, but a small section of my right eye is now permanently bloodshot. Belinda had been at the hospital with me. I don't remember this, but apparently all I kept doing was worrying whether they'd close the soup kitchen and that people had been able to get their meals, and she just kept assuring me that no, it was still running. Unfortunately, they were not able to catch the man who assaulted and permanently scarred me. He'd come bursting out that front door and nobody really had known why, and the whole thing had just been so sudden and bizarre. And the chances are, if it had happened to someone who didn't have a sensitive and unpleasant skin condition like mine, it would have just hurt like a mother lover, and that would have been that. Unfortunately, though, not in this case. I spent a few days in the hospital, and the thing that I kept telling myself was, this was just one guy. There are terrible people in every group, and the lesson that I've been taught here, I believe, is that forgiveness isn't necessarily what's important, but rather the lack of placing blame. So I still volunteer at that soup kitchen. I become friends with some of the regulars, and I wish I could do more to help them. Belinda couldn't believe it, but it just felt right. Now, I'm not some kind of saint, though. There's a part of me, a very dark part hidden deep in the back of my mind, who continues volunteering at that soup kitchen in case that guy returns. And if he does, maybe I'll throw some soup in his face. Most families have Thanksgiving traditions. Some of them are wholesome, some of them are silly, and some of them are just plain bizarre. I know this because I read a Reddit thread about them, and I was going to post my own family tradition and the outcome, but in the end I decided that I didn't want to bring the mood down into the Earth's core. So I thought, hey, why not send it into Let's Read instead? Look, I'm not going to pretend that my dad isn't an idiot. He is. An absolute goofball, and I love him for it, but he'd be the first to admit it. But sometimes his dumb flippery gets him into a bit of hot water. Things like managing to offend a waitress at Red Lobster somehow, or nearly losing a major contract at work for sending a boomer Minions meme to the company that they were courting. Now, this idiot is just bad at jokes. He once decided to prank Mom on April Fool's Day for telling her that he'd been cheating on her and wanted a divorce. Only the absolute clown got the date wrong and forgot that March has 31 days in it, and pulled the prank on the morning of March 31st, so Mom had absolutely no reason to suspect it was a joke. And boy, he had a lot of groveling to do after that one. And so you get the point. He's a lovable goofball boomer dad who just isn't funny at all, mostly, but he is indeed lovable. He also caused Thanksgiving to be pretty terrible one year. And so for many years, we had this old serrated electric carving knife for cutting the turkey. It was one of those serrated knives where they're not actually sharp unless you're sawing into something, and on top of that, it was blunted through years of use. And so every year, to entertain the kids, before cutting the turkey, he'd take this damn knife and pretend to cut his hand off with it. It was this whole gimmicky thing. He'd press the blade against his upper wrist, and then wow the little kids with how strong his skin was because he could just press a knife against it. And then for the final shock value, he'd turn the knife on by flicking the switch. Except, it wasn't plugged in, of course, and it wouldn't actually operate. And of course, the rest of the family had to then explain to the little kids that they shouldn't do this, and the knife was blunt, yada yada yada, and it was just some stupid thing Dad always did. And so this one year, the carving knife had finally died, and Mom replaced it with a new one. She told Dad, and she told him multiple times not to do his knife trick this year, and she made him promise, but I guess she didn't explain exactly why. Now here's the problem. Serrated blades can be crazy sharp if they're of a certain design. Electric carving knives these days are famous for being way, way more sharp than people realize. But Dad, in his arrogant wisdom, was still convinced that this wouldn't matter. Besides, it wasn't plugged in. He'd just be careful and make sure that he didn't press it into his skin too much. Of course, this was his explanation after the fact. At the time, none of us knew that he was going to do it. So picture the scene. There's about 15 family members crowded round the table in our large dining room, ready to fill their plates. Dad's about to do the opening ceremony and cut the turkey. And he does it, and he does the trick. He presses the blade against his wrist. Everyone starts to roll their eyes, and then Dad suddenly yells the F word because, even being as careful as possible, the serrated blade cuts right into his wrist. And then the pain causes his other hand to spasm, but it's okay, right, because the carving knife isn't plugged in. Well, no. It's not plugged in because it was a rechargeable knife. So his finger slips, he presses the switch, and we all watch in horror as his brand new, incredibly sharp electric carving knife slices through his wrist like butter. Everyone's screaming, except for Dad, who's just sort of staring down at his severed hand at the blood spraying from it. He's woozy, dizzy with shock, and sort of lifts his arm up, leaving the severed hand behind. And of course, blood sprays everywhere, all over the Thanksgiving dinner spread, all over the family, all over the screaming, crying family members. And I'm the one who springs into action. The knife's still running, embedded into the table now, and I reach through the blood and gore and shut it off. And then I grab my own father's hand and rush him to the kitchen to put it in a bag of ice. Meanwhile, other members of the family are trying to snap my dad out of the shock that he's clearly in. We're calling 911. Others are yelling that the ambulance will take too long, etc. In the end, I drag Dad to my car, throw him into the back seat, place his ice bag hand in the passenger seat, and just hightail it to the emergency room. And I'll never forget it. Dad was unable to say much of anything on the drive there, but he did let out one thing. "Thanks for giving me a hand, baby girl." God. If he hadn't been in the back seat with a severely bloody stump of a wrist, I probably would have punched him in the jaw in that moment. Unfortunately, they couldn't save his hand, as there was too much nerve damage that had been caused by the cut, and when my mom arrived at the hospital, she insisted on making up a slightly less embarrassing story of how he severed his hand. I forget the exact details, but I'm sure they didn't buy it. So, Dad only has one hand now. Thankfully, it was his left, and he's right-handed, and that's the thing he always says each year for Thanksgiving now. At least it wasn't my useful hand. And knowing Dad, he wants to say something even more cruder than that. So, that's how my lovable goofball dad effed around and found out, and if anyone asks, he tells them it was bitten off by a shark. He has a prosthetic hand now, and yes, you can best believe that he uses that damn prosthetic hand for boomer dad pranks wherever he can. And the best was last year. My daughter brought her new boyfriend over for Thanksgiving, and they're high school seniors, and her boyfriend is a sweetheart, and Dad introduces himself by walking up behind him, placing his prosthetic hand on the poor kid's lap and saying, "This is what happens to the last guy who got handsy with my granddaughter." Thankfully, me and my daughter had warned him in advance, and the smart-ass kid took the prosthetic hand, turned to face my father, and shook it with a very "pleased to meet you." I think he's a keeper. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to watch your 6, 7.